So for our next project, we're going to do a watercolor painting of a jungle scene, and we're going to be inspired by the French artist Henri Rousseau, Henry Rousseau. And so this is one of his most famous paintings, and he did these sort of fantastical illustrations of jungles. And that's what we're going to begin our inspiration with. So just a little note. So this is Henri Rousseau, and he's considered a post-impressionist. He died in 1910, and of course he's an artist. Don't confuse him with the other famous Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who died in 1778, was a philosopher, sort of wrote about the social contract. So there are two famous Rousseaus. What's really fun or fascinating or heartbreaking about Henri Rousseau is he had a very difficult life, um, and what he made out of it. You know, his father became a debtor while he was in high school, so he had to actually live at his high school. He worked in a tinsmith factory. Um, he committed a small crime and had to join the military. He eventually married and had six children, only one survived. And this part now, really, as far as his career as an artist, is he lived his life as a basically a tax collector on imported goods. So he was made fun of as this sort of naive painter. In fact, he's called a naive painter, which means innocent, untaught. He never got to go to art school. So, what's fascinating is he developed these scenes of jungles, but he never had the opportunity to travel to a jungle. So, these scenes are much more fantasies. He would go to the museums in Paris, where he lived, and looked at taxidermied animals. And he'd go to these big glass enclosed gardens and look at the vegetation. And he basically made up these fantastical jungle scenes, almost like a children's fantasy. So for ours, we're going to organize ours because it's so chaotic with a strong foreground, middle ground, background. So foreground, middle ground, background. A trick that you can also use to organize your picture is that your foreground should have more detail and it should have more contrast in the colors. There should be more difference between the darks and lights. The middle ground becomes a little less so, and your background can really become less contrast and less bold color. That's where your colors could actually start becoming actually truly dull. So again, foreground, middle ground, background. Look at that contrast. Look at the foreground. That green and that deep, almost blackish green creates this strong contrast. The middle ground still has some contrast, but definitely less. Look at the background. Every color in that part of the photograph has been basically mixed with white. If you squint your eyes, you can really see how it's all kind of merging towards this bluish, dull lavender. So we're going to create, again, just an absolute fantasy of a jungle. And I want you to know that you don't have to use any sort of scientific basis. So animals that don't exist together are welcome to be in the same jungle. Animals that don't exist are welcome to be in your jungle. This is an illustration by a contemporary artist, again, who you can see is inspired by Henri Rousseau. Here's another illustration. And again, some of these animals may never actually cross paths in nature, but that's the fantasy. You can have unicorns and Pegasus and mermaids and elephants and a domestic house cat all in the same jungle. So again, we're going to replicate it. Normally I use dip pen, but you're going to draw with your Bic pen and create a strong foreground, middle ground, background. And then use your watercolors to develop your color scheme until you get to a final project. So this will be on 12 by 18 inch paper, outlined with pen, crosshatch shading, and painted with watercolors. And just a complete over-the-top fantasy jungle scene.